This from President Zelensky of Ukraine. He's commented about that missile strike, and he's in no doubt. He says it is a significant escalation in the conflict and that action is needed. That from President Zelensky of Ukraine. Well, let's talk to our Defence and Security Editor, Deborah Haynes. And Deborah, President Zelensky then in no doubt, as I say, they're saying it is a significant escalation, and that is precisely what NATO is trying to work out.
Yes, it's very important for NATO to understand, or NATO members to understand exactly what's happened before they can come out with any kind of response, because this is such a grave situation. Poland is a member of the NATO alliance. Ever since the war in Ukraine was launched by Russia, there has been huge concern about the potential for escalation beyond Ukraine's borders. Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance, and NATO allies and Russia, it has to be said, have clearly tried very hard, have been trying very hard to avoid direct confrontation between Russia and NATO, because everybody knows that that kind of direct confrontation could lead to a much wider war, potentially the Third World War. It's that serious. This is what we're talking about here. And that's why it's absolutely crucial to understand exactly what's happened, who was responsible for these explosions. Was it a deliberate strike? It would seem perhaps not. And also then how it happened. And the NATO allies will then be wanting to think about their response. Of course, there is Article 5, which is that collective, unifying, fundamental principle of NATO. An attack on one is an attack on all, and all come to the defence of the ally that is under attack. But in order for Article 5 to be implemented, all allies have to agree. And so that is going to be key as well, before anyone is going to be making any political decision, because it's a political decision ultimately to launch, to make an Article 5 action. All 30 member states will have to agree, and they'll have to agree on what happened, who was responsible and why. And so you're not going to have a rush, I don't think, to come out with an exact decision in that sense, but it is incredibly serious, and you're getting a sense of that seriousness from the different statements we're getting from different officials. You've had NATO releasing a comment from an official saying that we are looking into these reports and closely coordinating with our ally Poland. For Ukraine, you've just talked about what the president was saying about calling this an escalation. It's an escalation, of course, in the crisis, but the key will be whether or not it was deliberate, and that is going to be fundamental in NATO formulating its response, and there will be a response of some sort, but we'll have to wait to see what that will look like.
And Deborah, as you say there, well, those facts being established, but what is indisputable is that yet again today, Russia has been murdering Ukrainian civilians with these missile strikes on major population centres right across the country, which is seen as the Russian response to the G20 being addressed by President Zelensky.
It must seem quite bizarre for people who maybe don't follow the sort of NATO alliance sort of policies closely, to see a country in Europe that is clearly very allied with the UK, with other European NATO allies, and yet this bombardment, as you say, is taking place in Ukraine, and there aren't NATO boots on the ground trying to defend the Ukrainians. But it just underlines the fact that NATO and Ukraine are separate. NATO is not directly involved in the conflict. Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance, and so it can't draw on the fundamental principles of collective defence and deterrence, which is what is enshrined by being a member of NATO. And instead, though, you're having individual nations many of them NATO member states, many of them also not, unilaterally providing support to Ukraine with these weapons, with enhanced weapon systems. The attacks today and these blasts across the border in Poland are already prompting countries such as Latvia to speak out and talk about increased air defences. You'll remember at the beginning of the conflict, there was that plea from Ukraine to close the skies, to get NATO allies to come and protect Ukraine's airspace. And at the time, countries like the UK, like the US, said they did not want to take that step because closing the skies would mean having British, American, and other NATO allied air defence systems, which will be surface-to-air missile systems and fighter jets, patrolling the skies and shooting down potentially Russian aircraft, Russian missiles. And that is that direct confrontation that I was talking about before, that both sides have been trying to avoid. And so what you've seen instead of this direct intervention by countries like the UK in terms of protecting Ukraine's airspace, they have been giving Ukraine the means to protect the airspace themselves. They obviously have their own air defence capabilities. They have their own air force. But over the past nearly 9 months now, that has been significantly bolstered by the weapon systems that have been coming into Ukraine from across NATO allied countries. It's not a NATO mission, it's individual allies. This is this sort of NATO contact group led by the United States that have been absolutely fundamental in helping Ukraine to protect itself. And yes, we've seen today this horrendous bombardment once more in Ukraine, but it would have been even worse had it not been for the weapons that Ukraine has been given to protect itself.
OK, Deborah, many thanks for the assessment there, our Defence and Security Editor, Deborah Haynes. Well, I want to bring in Siobhan Robbins now, joins us from Berlin. And Siobhan, in terms of people perhaps just joining us, let's rewind a bit and tell us more about the circumstances, what we know and what we don't know.
Yes, so it's been reported that a missile or missiles, Russian missile or missiles, has hit a grain store in Poland on the Ukrainian border in a village called Przewodów. We're being told that 2 people have died. We know that the Pentagon has said it's looking into these reports, that the Polish Prime Minister has called an emergency meeting saying this is a crisis situation. He's talking to his defence officials now to find out what's going on. We know a similar situation is happening in Hungary as well. They're having an emergency meeting too. And we're getting reaction from various countries across Europe and also in the US. And I think what's important to note, which everyone has been saying tonight, is there's very, very cautious language, whether it's coming out of NATO or the US or Europe, around what has happened. And that shows you just how tense this situation is. I'm going to give you a flavour of some of the lines that have been coming out of various places so that you can really get up to speed with what's going on. So first of all, we've had NATO saying we're looking into these reports and closely coordinating with our ally Poland. Then we've had President Zelensky of Ukraine saying we've warned that Russia's actions are not limited to Ukraine. Reuters, a news agency, reporting that the Russian Defence Ministry denies that these are Russian missiles deliberately striking Poland. It says that it's a deliberate provocation to escalate the situation. And then we've had Estonia coming out saying this is most alarming. The Czech Republic saying if Poland confirms the missiles also hit its territory, this will be a further escalation by Russia. And really, that's the point now that everyone is looking at. Was this a deliberate attack on Poland, which we know has been extremely strong in its stance against Russia ever since this war in Ukraine broke out? Or was this an accident? That's what the conversations will be going on behind the scenes right now. What's going to happen? Because we've said it time and time again over the last hour or so. The big problem here is that Poland is a NATO member, and that is an issue because if this is a deliberate attack, then there'll be conversations around whether other NATO members should react to protect this member. It wouldn't happen immediately, as you've heard from Deborah Haynes, and there'll obviously be discussions about, was this an accident? Was this something that the Russians can deny to diffuse the situation, but they will be the key questions now being looked at around the world.
OK, Siobhan, thank you very much indeed. Siobhan Robbins there in Berlin, and you'll have heard Siobhan telling us there that the Russian Defence Ministry denying any involvement in the incident at all, saying it's a deliberate provocation. So let's get more now on the view from Moscow with our correspondent there, Diana Magnay. And Diana, I suppose pretty much expected that this would be the Russian position. Presumably then they're saying it's a so-called false flag operation.
Well, they're just saying that it doesn't have anything to do with them and that there were no strikes from Russian missile systems along the Ukrainian-Polish border today, and that the photos that are appearing on Polish media of the weapons debris have nothing to do with Russian weapons, and they're calling it a deliberate provocation in order to escalate the situation. So, I mean, I think there are two possible theories. One is, was this a mistake? The other is it a way of testing NATO's resolve at a time when the G20 is taking place? President Putin is obviously not there. It could also be that, for example, this was one of those missiles that was one of many today striking key Ukrainian energy infrastructure, especially, which was taken down by Ukrainian air defence. And we have debris hitting in Poland, and we know that 2 people were killed. So there are a number of possible eventualities. And as we were hearing from Lord Dannatt, as we were hearing from Deborah Haynes there, I think that it will take a lot of cool minds to make sure that there is no dramatic escalation. But, you know, knowing Russia's track record, it is quite possible that they would try and test the waters with a strike which they can plausibly deny. But at the same time, if this was just one of the many missiles that hit Ukraine or were targeted at Ukraine today and was taken down by Ukrainian air defence and it landed the other side of the border, then that too is a very real possibility. So I think we're in a dangerous situation, one where, of course, you have all the leaders of Eastern Europe and NATO wondering what to do next, and one where I imagine if the Ministry of Defence's latest post is to go by, Russia will deny over and over again. The question is, if we discount the idea that this was an accident, what is Vladimir Putin trying to achieve? Does he really want to escalate this in a way that involves NATO? Of course, in his own country, his people are being told continually that this is essentially and effectively a war against NATO in any case, and that NATO is supplying the weapons to Ukraine. NATO is essentially the master of Ukraine, that this is a war for Russia's defence against NATO. And I have no doubt that President Putin feels pretty aggrieved that he's not sitting as a trusted member of the G20 or, in fact, in the G20 at all, and wants to mark the moment, especially after President Zelensky's address, calling it the G19, etc. But whether he is choosing to make a deliberate strike on a NATO member state, knowing the consequences, knowing the responsibilities for all NATO members under Article 5 is a completely different story. And I think that cool heads should prevail. We need to sit tight and try and work out what went on.
Diana, many thanks. Diana Magnay in Moscow there. And let's just share with you a photograph just in of the aftermath of that strike on the Polish village Przewodów on the border with Ukraine. Well, you can see here the notable plume of smoke there. That's what we've got so far. Those reports that a Russian missile has crossed the border between Ukraine and Poland and hit that village, Przewodów,